I'm Jennifer Della Quadri, and this is the Raising Happy Teens podcast, where you learn how to successfully guide your teenager into adulthood without losing your sanity in the process. Let's do this. Welcome back to the podcast. One of the hot topics that comes up a lot when it comes to the topic of parenting teens, just parenting in general, is phone use or screen time. And this applies to teens specifically because that's when most of them start getting a phone. But really, it applies to all ages in parenting because screens are available and introduced in different ways at much younger ages too. And parents are often at a loss when it comes to deciding what is a healthy, quote unquote, amount of screen time. And I'm speaking from my personal experience, but I'm also talking about the parents I talk to in my coaching practice. Decisions like when to get your kid their first smartphone, when to allow them to have social media, all of those decisions need to be made. And it's kind of been like the Wild West for about a decade now. And unfortunately, it's the kids who are paying the price. Our lack of awareness and just the lack of guidance in general is really starting to show. And hopefully this is turning around. As with everything I talk about on this podcast, any idea I present comes from a place of awareness and curiosity, never judgment, because when we know better, we do better. And most of us just don't know when it comes to screen time and phone use and all of that, myself included. We are all, as parents, on the lookout for guidance, for best practices and ways to support our kids in a healthy way so that they will grow into balanced and resilient, confident adults. And like I said, when it comes to phone use and screen times, there's just been a general lack of information about that impact that it has on teens and guidelines on how to set healthy boundaries to minimize a negative impact of all of the use. Which is why when I heard about the book I'm going to be talking about in this episode, I jumped at the opportunity to read it. And the book I'm going to be speaking about in this episode is called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And it's written by Jonathan Haidt. So this is a phenomenal book. And I really liked it because it provides a lot of research and theories to back up what my assumptions that I've held for a long time about the increase of mental illness in teenagers being directly correlated with the introduction of the smartphone. And so I got this book, I devoured it, I took notes, I highlighted, I earmarked, I did all the things, all the important data so that I could come here and present it to you here on the podcast. It kind of reminded me what it was like to be an undergrad when I was studying psychology. There's just so much great information in there. And I will be breaking it up, some of this information, into 2 episodes. So in this episode and in the next, I'm going to be talking about the research and the concepts from this book. And I'm also going to be sharing some of my thoughts and stories from my clients and in my own teens. I highly recommend that you read this book, you check it out, because yes, I'm going to be giving you the Cliff's Notes version, but there's just so much great information in there that you would definitely benefit from seeing so that you can make decisions on your own and just be informed in general. But if you don't have the time or you don't have the inclination to do it, I've got you. This is really information that I feel like all parents need to know. So whether you get it here or you read the book or both, it's going to shift the way you think about smartphones and also about social media. So in this week's episode, I'm going to be talking about the part of the book that discusses the transition from play-based to phone-based childhood. I'm also going to be sharing information about the opportunity cost of a phone-based childhood and how the author, Jonathan Haidt's recommendation I'm going to discuss the benefits of, or the way to keep the benefits of play based childhood and reduce the cost of a phone based childhood in your home. And then next week, I'm going to talk a little more about the impact that phones and social media have on girls and boys, and also video games, specifically with boys, and what can be done as a community, in schools, and together as parents that we can do to reduce the negative impact on our kids. So let's dive in. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about my personal experience as a parent and why I'm so interested in this topic. Because it comes from a place of, yes, professionally, I like to know the information that's going to be helpful for my clients, but I'm also really interested in it personally because my kids are on the older end of the teen years. They're 17 and 19. And smartphones began to be introduced when they were still pretty young. And I remember seeing the older kids, and I say at that time they were probably about 12, they would have phones in their hands. And I just felt in my gut that that couldn't be a good thing. And I found myself being irritated by it and annoyed by it, and also just really concerned about it. And like I said, at that time, there just wasn't a lot of information about, is this okay? What's all right? What's the impact? And to be completely honest with you, I did not want my kids to have a phone. I wanted to hold off as long as possible. And unfortunately, they got a phone way before I wanted them to. And it wasn't my decision. That's another story. Lo and behold, they have a phone. And when I read this book, I've been bringing up the topic with my girls. And that's another reason why I recommend that you get it, because it's really a great foundation for some fantastic discussions to have with your teenager, because it's not just you saying, oh, I think this, or I believe this. It's the research has shown. And one thing I know for sure is that teens respond more to facts than they do on your parenting opinion. So, like I said, I held out for longer than most parents, but my girls, they'll point that out to me. Their friends had phones. They had social media before their friends did, before they did. And I was the one parent who was always very cautious about it. And fortunately enough, we lived in an area where they still were able to get a play-based childhood. They were able to get outside, they were able to play. But I definitely saw a shift in their willingness or interest in being outside and playing at around the age 12, which coincidentally or not coincided with when they got their phone and when their friends were getting their phone. So, what's happening here, and maybe you're seeing this in your teen as well, is that parents are seeing a shift. Their once young, happy, easygoing child suddenly starts to turn inward and pull away, and parents are feeling helpless to do anything about it. And this goes along with the introduction of the smartphone. Parents just don't know what to do about it. And the truth is, when it comes to this withdrawal, this started long before the pandemic. Haidt, the author, shares a lot of research findings on the prevalence of things like anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide in teenagers, all the way dating back to the early 2000s to about 2020. So the research was done mostly before the pandemic hit. And what his research is showing is that in all of these areas that I mentioned, there was a marked increase of all of those things from the span of 2010 on. So, yes, there was a slow increase in these challenges that teens were having, but around the date of 2010, it got really, there was kind of a level balance in the number of teens who were struggling with these things and experiencing these things. But around 2010, there was a spike. It was a surge. between 2010 and 2015 that just kept climbing after that. And this surge directly correlates with the introduction of the smartphone. So, this is the time that Haidt concludes that the great rewiring of childhood occurred. That's his theory in this book. The big idea that he has here and that he's presenting is that between 2010 and 2015, it marked the beginning of the phone-based childhood and the end of a play-based childhood. So I'm going to break that down for you. First, just by describing what phone-based is and what childhood is, according to this book. So phone-based, when he's talking about phone-based, it refers to all internet-connected devices. So that means video games, laptops, YouTube, phones, anything that is within that realm is considered phone-based. And then for him, childhood encompasses childhood and also adolescence. So that kind of helps clarify what phone-based and childhood means. So defining play-based childhood, basically what that means is the majority of free time is spent with friends in the real world. And some of the defining components are that it's embodied, which means it uses bodies to communicate. It's synchronous, so happening at the same time. And it's one-to-one or one-to-several. And in groups where there's some cost to join or leave, so there's an investment in the relationship. And phone-based, that is described as being disembodied, so no body is needed, just language. It's heavily asynchronous, so it's happening via text or post or comments. And it's one-to-many communications with interactions happening in parallel. And there's also a low bar for entry and exit. So the relationships are short-lived and more disposable. So this book has a really interesting viewpoint on smartphones and tablets as being experience blockers. And the book gives an example of, for giving an infant, for example, a tablet or an iPad that's loaded with movies about walking. But because they're so engrossed with these movies, they never actually put in the time or effort to practice walking. This is obviously just an example. This is not necessarily what they're talking about in the book, but the idea is that part of our human nature, part of our natural development is to learn to walk and to want to learn to walk. But in this analogy, because we have videos that are just so interesting, why would I learn to walk when I have this at my fingertips to entertain me and to kind of fill that void? I'm not going to go learn to walk because that's hard, that's work. So it's so engrossing that it blocks the experience. And another thing that is really interesting that I'm sure you all experience yourself is that even when our kids or even we are not on our devices and they appear to be doing something in the real world, like eating or studying or even hanging out with you, some of their attention is on thinking about and worrying about what's happening in the social metaverse. And you may think about this yourself too. Some of my clients have mentioned having FOMO when they are away from their phone for too long. Like, what if I'm missing out on something important? What if I fall behind or have missed something that I need to know right away? And it's just that internal feeling. So the distraction is there even when the device isn't. And I am all for getting out there and experiencing things, right? Like doing the thing versus watching it on a screen. And I'm sure we can all agree that having a screen in your pocket, it poses a greater temptation than having a TV in your house or a PC at home. Because it's right there, it's accessible. And when you go in the Wayback Machine, like thinking about when you grew up, and for me, when I grew up, I remember people would talk about the influence of TV and that kids were watching too much TV and that it was rotting our brains. Of course, it wasn't, but it was an easy and entertaining distraction. Something to do when you didn't know what to do or when you didn't want to do the thing. And we, as adults, we grew up in the wave of constant availability of TV programming. that and video games really impacted our willingness and desire to just get outside and experience the world. So think about it. Even back then, if you didn't have a TV or if you didn't have video games, you're bored. So you leave the house, you go outside. What else is there to do? I can't just sit here and do nothing. But because the TV was there, like, why would I go outside? Why would I go try to find friends and ride my bike when I've got this awesome TV show or all these fun video games here to keep me company? And this is a natural human instinct. We are naturally drawn to the easiest way out. It's in our nature. It's a self-preservation tactic to avoid discomfort and danger. Right? And thank goodness for that. It's a good thing. But we also need to be challenged, even if it's uncomfortable. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, I know you're on board with that. It's good to be challenged. And that's a term that was brought up in this book. I'm going to share a term with you that was brought up in this book. I'd heard of it before, but it had been a while. And the term is anti-fragility. This is something that was coined by Nassim Taleb in the book Anti-Fragile: Things That Gain from Disorder. And the idea is that organisms actually need to get challenged, knocked over, to become strong. And there is a story about a biome that was created, and the trees were in it, and all the trees were dying and wilting, and it's because they didn't have the wind to push them over. So it's true in organisms, but it's also very true in humans. And the theory is that the experience of getting knocked down makes us strong. Like the immune system, you need to be exposed to dirt and parasites and bacteria to build a stronger immune system. And there's also a psychological immune system, which is the ability to handle, process, and get past frustrations. Things like minor accidents, teasing, exclusion, normal conflicts, without spending hours and hours and hours in inner turmoil. So we as humans need to experience that. Our kids need to experience that. Our kids also need to experience jumping off the swing, climbing trees, having rough and tumble play, using tools like hammers and drills. They provide a thrill, they're exciting, and it's also challenging. And then when you think about something like video games, yeah, that's a thrill, that's a challenge, but it does not offer any of the risk that all of these real world experiences would offer. There's the challenge, there's the excitement, but your psychological immune system is not challenged by these things. So now back to what I was talking about before with that pull to just stay inside and do the quote, easy thing. When smartphones were introduced, the pull to stay inside got even stronger. And so, yes, I am here to say smartphones can be amazing. You can learn a lot there. You can connect with people. There's a lot of interesting experiences you can have on a smartphone. Smartphones are not bad. But because they're so interesting, that's why they're a problem. Because they reduce interest in non-screen-based forms of experience. They literally push out the interest of having a non-phone activity. And this isn't just the case for kids, right? It's true for parents as well. I'm sure you can relate. So even when everyone, think about you as a family and the impact smartphones have on you as a family. When do they come out? Are they around during dinner time? Do you have rules around that? Because even when people are home together, you may all be home, the interactivity can be reduced. Like think about you're all sitting there alone together. Alone meaning you're in your own little world with your phone and your device, but you're together physically, which is different than something like watching TV or a movie or even playing a video game, because everyone is having their own experience versus everyone is having a shared experience where you can talk about it, laugh about it, right? All of those things where you're both having that experience in tandem. So you may be together physically, but you're not necessarily in the same space mentally, which kind of reminds me of the book Ready Player One. If you haven't read that, read it. There's also a movie. But you imagine the person who's sitting there wherever they are physically, but their brain is somewhere completely different mentally because they've got these goggles on and they're living in a completely different universe. So there could be somebody sitting next to them, physically, maybe even touching them, but their brains are in two completely different places. So every time I think about that idea, I'm like, oh my gosh, we're heading to a Ready Player One crazy universe world where we're all disconnected, but connected in a different way. Anyway, that is a dystopian world that I hope we never enter. And that's a side note for sure. But you know the idea, and you've probably experienced that in your house. So let me talk a little bit about the opportunity cost of a phone-based childhood. And there's four things that the book points out. One being social deprivation. So there is research in this book about that. And my mind was blown by this, and this is why I want to share it here. Basically, in social deprivation, kids were spending less time with their friends in person. And the research was showing that it went from 160 minutes to 40 minutes a day between the years of 2003 and 2019. So around 2003 it was about 160 minutes a day, and around 2019 it was about 40 minutes. That's a huge reduction. This study was specifically for ages 15 to 24. I'd be curious to know what it would be like for younger kids, but think about the impact that that would have on your ability to socialize if you're only spending 40 minutes a day on average in person with friends. And I'm definitely going to be talking more further on, either in this episode or next week, about why that's happening. But the general idea is, why do I need to socialize in person when I have my phone and I can FaceTime my friends or I can text with my friends? And there's definitely a missing component there with the embodiment and the synchronous. Um, with the embodiment and the synchronicity of the experience. So, socially deprived. The second one is sleep deprivation. That's a really big one too, because you think about the importance of sleep, not just for everyone, but on a developing adolescent brain and body, and how important it is to have good quality sleep. So, the research that they present in this book was that it went from 30% of teens saying that they got less than 7 hours of sleep a night around 1991 to 50% of teens saying they get less than 7 hours of sleep a night to 2019. 30 to 50%. And think about less than 7 hours. I don't know about you, but when I get less than 7 hours of sleep, I'm tired. And I'm not a growing teenager. Teenagers need 10 plus hours of sleep, 9, I guess, on a good night. But less than 7 hours of sleep over time, that's chronic fatigue happening there. And that's 50%. And the study went to 2019. I would be interested to know what it is now. I don't know if it's improved or not, but that's fascinating. And what was most fascinating about that, that's a big range for the time period of the study, but there was a huge increase in 2013. 2013, right in the middle of when smartphones were introduced in adolescent lives. Number 3 is attention fragmentation. So your ability to pay attention and stay on task in one line of thinking, avoiding getting distracted by something else. It seems like so many people are realizing that they have ADHD, and I'd be curious to know how many of those people had ADHD and they're just finding out, or if it was somehow made worse or more apparent with the introduction of a smartphone. And the book gives a really great analogy of imagining your ability to stay focused on one thing as you're driving on a freeway, and then there's off ramps all over the place. Each of those off ramps represents a distraction or something else. So when you think about your phone, every notification is an off ramp that presents itself. And it's really hard to stay on task when you're constantly being pulled away. And one of the studies actually found that the number of notifications on young people's phones from social media and communication apps amounts to 192 notifications a day. So if they have their notifications turned on, just imagine they can start focusing on something and then bing. What is that? It's a text. Oh no, what is that? Did I get a comment or am I missing something? And even if they have their notifications turned off, there's a pull. Like, I need to check in on that. I don't want to be missing something. So just having that constant pull really impacts their ability to pay attention to anything. And then number 4 was addiction, which in simple terms is there's a trigger. And we're talking about phones here. There's a trigger. You get a notification. And then there's an action that has previously been rewarded. So for example, in the past, you look at the notification and you see that your post got liked. You got a notification, you want to see, did I get a like, or was it a positive comment? And there's been a reward in the past, so there's a pull to see. But this reward is variable. So sometimes it's good and sometimes maybe not. And there have been lots of studies done about the pull of a variable reward versus one that you know is going to be there. So when it's variable, the pull is even stronger because you want to keep checking and you're wanting that positive reinforcement so bad that you keep looking back. Is it there? Is it there? Is it there? So that's the pull. And it's not necessarily because it's good. It's a craving for that good reward. And then finally, on top of that feeds into the addiction is there's an investment into the whole thing. Because, for example, in social media, you've set up a profile, you've made some connections, or the time that you've invested in it, in growing your social media or making posts. So that's the cycle of it. That's the pull that gets them coming back. And Haidt, the author, he offers a solution. This is the thing that's going to be helpful for you here. This is not to like toot the horn and be like, oh, alert, alert, danger, danger, change everything. Take your kid's phone. No, I'm not saying that. I'm going to share the solution that he offers to reverse or turn around this impact of the transition that he discusses, the play-based to the phone-based, to help kids become more resilient and become more anti-fragile. And so he shares a strategy for how to do that. And if you have younger kids, great. You can take this information and run with it and implement it in your own house. If you have young teens, there may be some, work that needs to be done there. If you have older teens, you may be thinking, oh, well, I guess I missed my chance. There's always ways to turn things around, and that starts with awareness. So listen to all of this, take it in, evaluate it, see how it resonates with you, and also come to a decision. Is this something you want to do, something you want to try and implement? And he calls it building a ladder from childhood to adulthood. And the whole thing is to get kids to be more independent while also lessening the impact and the pull that a smart phone would have on their childhood. And the point too being that these are critical years in our kids' lives. Their brains are still developing, they're still getting their self-concept going, and the less exposure that they have to social media and to being addicted to a phone at these critical points in their lives, the better. So this ladder is based on even years of a kid's life, starting at age 6 to get them more independent doing things like introducing chores and an allowance. So things that they're in charge of and also things that they get rewarded for them at home. No discussion about a smartphone. There are no smartphones. Just 6, it's not there. And then at age 8, that's when more independence is given. So hanging out without adult supervision and playing with friends without adult supervision. And this may include, depending on where you live, running errands, local errands without an adult around, and being just more responsible for things. Having that thrill of independence with a level of safety as well. And at this point, he recommends introducing a device for communication, but not a smartphone. So some way to communicate. I know that they have watches and they have some type of devices where you can communicate without having access to the internet. Then at age 12, more independence and possibly earning your own money by mowing lawns, babysitting, doing things for the neighborhood or the neighbors, and just basically starting to be responsible for yourself. And then also recommending finding adult mentors that are not parents. So this could be coaches, parents, teachers, scout leaders, other people in the community who can be a mentor for the kids. Then at age 14, that's when the big transition happens and they get into high school. And there's also going to be more independence, just increased independence, continuation. And that's when they get their first smartphone. No social media, but their first smartphone. And then at age 16, more independence, driving, getting a job, and that's when they can open social media accounts. And he recommends too letting that be a legal decision. So it's not just you as parents saying, you know what, you can't have until 16. I know so and so, and everybody else you know in the entire world has social media, but you can't have it. But letting this be a decision on a national level and letting there be legal recourse for it. That's his recommendation. And I will be talking in next week's episode on a little bit more on the fact that this has to be a community effort. This is not just you solo. It's hard to do as a parent. I was just talking with one of my clients today who said it's hard for her to relate with one of her friends because her friend doesn't have TikTok. So she doesn't know the things that she's talking about. And this is a challenge, right? It's hard for the kids and it's hard for the parents. So this is definitely an ongoing shift, and it's something that needs to happen on a greater scale than just inside your home. So I very much am aware of that. So when you hear 16, no social media, you may be thinking, yeah, right. There's no way in heck I would be able to hold off. And I hear you, I feel you, I am with you. Which is why next week I'm going to be sharing a little more information on this book on the impact social media has on girls specifically. I'll also be talking about video games with boys, and I'll dive a little bit more into how we as adults, as parents, as a community, also the government community, how we can all band together to be part of the solution so that we can start to create a healthier childhood for our kids. So take this, read the book, talk with your kids about it, start there. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. Leave a comment below, share with me what you think about this episode, what you think about this idea. This is definitely an ongoing conversation, and I would just love to hear from you. So I will follow up with you next week, share a little more information. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. If you liked this episode, I'd like to invite you to join Raising Happy Teens, my free online community for parents of teenagers, where every week I host Ask a Coach. You bring your parenting questions, and I provide expert advice and coaching. Click the link in the show notes to join today. I'll see you inside.